The car stopped outside the iron gates, and Alina Hart's hands were shaking before she even stepped out. Rain hit the windshield in sharp lines, and through the glass she could see the Cross mansion rising like a wall of stone and glass, cold and enormous, waiting for her the way a courtroom waits for a verdict. She was not walking into a marriage. She was walking into a sentence. Julian Cross stood at the top of the entrance steps, unmoving, his dark coat soaked at the shoulders because he had refused to hold an umbrella. He did not smile. He did not move to help her with her bag. When she reached him, breathless, her heels slipping on the wet stone, he said only one sentence, and it landed harder than the storm. "Never enter my heart." Alina froze. She had expected coldness. She had prepared herself for distance, but she had not expected a warning delivered like a verdict, spoken before she had even crossed the threshold of his home. Her father's company was drowning in debt, and this marriage was the rope that kept her family from going under. She had signed papers, shaken hands with lawyers, smiled for photographers who cared nothing for her. She had told herself she was ready for anything. She was not ready for this. "I understand," she said, because there was nothing else to say. Her voice did not shake, even though her whole body did. Julian studied her for a long moment, rain dripping from his hair onto his sharp cheekbones, his eyes unreadable. Then he turned and walked inside, leaving her to follow or to stand alone in the storm. She followed. She had no choice. Inside, the mansion was even colder than the weather outside. Marble floors stretched in every direction, polished so hard they reflected the chandeliers like frozen lakes. Staff moved past her without meeting her eyes, as though she were furniture being delivered rather than a bride arriving. A woman with sharp cheekbones and sharper eyes stood near the staircase, arms folded, watching Alina the way a hawk watches something small on the ground. This was Vivian Cross, Julian's younger sister, and her expression made it clear that Alina was not welcome, not now, not ever. "So this is the girl," Vivian said, not to Alina but to the room, as if Alina could not hear her. "The one who married my brother for money." "That is enough," Julian said, but there was no real force behind it, no protection in his voice. He said the words the way a man recites a rule he does not care to enforce. Alina said nothing. She had learned, over the terrible weeks since her father's company collapsed, that silence protected her better than defense ever could. She lifted her chin, walked past Vivian without flinching, and let a maid lead her up the wide staircase to a room that felt more like a prison cell dressed in silk than a bedroom. That night, alone in the enormous bed, Alina did not cry. She had promised herself she would not cry in this house, not where anyone might hear her and use it as another weapon. Instead, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain finally stop outside, and she thought about the man downstairs who had warned her away from his heart before she had even asked to enter it. She did not know yet that his warning came from grief, not cruelty. She did not know about Sophia Lane, the woman Julian had loved before the world took her from him, or the whispers that followed her disappearance like smoke after a fire no one had properly put out. All Alina knew was that she had married a stranger who wanted her present but not seen, useful but not close, and that she would have to learn how to survive inside that space without losing herself completely. The next morning came with a schedule pinned to her door instead of a good morning. Breakfast at 7. Public appearances twice a month. No physical contact required, none expected. Julian had written it himself, his handwriting sharp and efficient, like a man organizing an asset rather than beginning a marriage. Alina read it twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in a drawer she did not plan to open again. She dressed in silence, wondering how many mornings like this one waited for her in the months ahead, and she did not yet know that somewhere across the city, a quiet architect named Nathaniel Hale had just accepted a contract to redesign the Cross family's cultural foundation building, a decision that would soon walk him directly into her path. She went downstairs for breakfast because the schedule told her to. Julian was already seated, reading something on his phone, not looking up when she entered. Vivian sat across from him, sipping coffee, smiling the way people smile when they enjoy watching someone struggle. "Sleep well?" Vivian asked, though her tone made clear she hoped the answer was no. Well enough, Alina said, taking her seat. Julian finally looked up, his eyes moving over her the way one checks that a piece of furniture has been placed correctly in a room. He nodded once, as if satisfied she had followed instructions, and returned to his phone. There was no warmth in the gesture, no curiosity about the woman now living under his roof, only the quiet confirmation that the arrangement was proceeding as planned. Alina ate in silence, her stomach tight, and told herself this was temporary. She would find her footing. She would learn the rules of this cold house, and she would survive it, the way she had survived every hard thing since her father's world collapsed around them. What she did not know, sitting at that long table in the gray morning light, was that survival was about to become something far more complicated than she expected, because kindness, when it finally came, would arrive from a direction she had not thought to guard. By mid-morning, Julian had already left for his office without a word, and Vivian had disappeared into whatever part of the mansion she used to avoid being useful. Alina wandered the halls alone, tracing her fingers along cold walls, memorizing turns so she would not get lost again the way she had the previous evening. The house felt less like a home and more like a museum where she was the only exhibit no one wanted to visit. She found a garden behind the east wing, half-wild compared to the rest of the manicured grounds, and she sat there for an hour simply breathing, letting the noise in her chest settle. It was the first quiet she had felt since the wedding, and she promised herself she would return to this spot whenever the house became too much to bear. That evening, at a formal charity dinner she had not been told she would attend until an assistant handed her a dress an hour before departure, Alina stood at the edge of a glittering ballroom, feeling like a prop rented for the occasion. Julian greeted guests with practiced charm, his hand occasionally resting at the small of her back for photographs, then withdrawing the moment the cameras looked away. Each touch and release felt like a small lesson in what she meant to him. Useful, present, not real. It was during one of these photographs, smiling for a camera while her chest ached with exhaustion, that she noticed a man standing near the edge of the room, not mingling, not performing, simply watching the crowd with quiet attention. He had kind eyes and an unhurried way of standing, as though he belonged to himself rather than to the spectacle around him. When their eyes met briefly, he did not look away in discomfort the way most people did around her. He simply gave a small, respectful nod, the kind one gives a person, not a decoration. She did not know his name yet. She did not know he was the architect hired to redesign the family's cultural foundation, a project that would keep him near this house for months to come. She only knew that for one brief moment in a room full of people who saw her as an arrangement, someone had looked at her and seen a person standing there, tired and trying, and that small recognition settled into her chest like the first warm thing she had felt in days. Later in the car home, Julian did not ask how the evening had felt for her. He checked messages on his phone, his jaw tight, his mind clearly somewhere far from the seat beside him. Alina watched the city lights slide past the window and thought about the quiet man's nod, small as it was, and wondered why it was the only part of the entire evening she wanted to remember. She did not yet understand that this small kindness was the beginning of something neither she nor Julian could stop once it started. She only knew that for the first time since stepping through those iron gates, she had felt, for one brief second, that someone in that glittering, indifferent world had actually seen her. The days that followed fell into a rhythm Alina had not chosen, but slowly learned to survive. Breakfast in silence. Julian gone before 9. Vivian's comments sharp enough to draw blood without ever leaving a visible mark. And in between all of it, small stretches of time she spent in the wild garden behind the east wing, the only place in the mansion that did not feel like it was watching her. It was there, 3 days after the charity dinner, that she saw the quiet man again. He was standing near the old stone wall at the edge of the garden, a folder of drawings under his arm, studying the building beyond as though it held answers he was determined to find. He noticed her before she could retreat. "I did not mean to intrude," he said, his voice calm and even. "I am working on the foundation building past the wall. I did not expect anyone to be out here this early." "It is my favorite place in this house," Alina admitted, surprising herself with the honesty. Or the only place that feels like mine? He tilted his head slightly, studying her the way one studies something unexpectedly interesting rather than something to be measured or judged. That is a strange thing to say about your own home. It is not my home, she said before she could stop herself. Not yet, maybe not ever. He did not press her further, and she was grateful for that. Instead, he introduced himself simply, without title or flourish. Nathaniel Hale. I am redesigning the foundation building for the family trust. Alina, she said, and left it there without the surname that came with expectations she did not want attached to this small, unguarded moment. They spoke for only a few minutes that morning about nothing important: the weather, the strange shape of an old tree near the wall, the way morning light fell differently on stone than on glass. But when he left, walking back toward the foundation site with his folder of drawings, Alina realized she had smiled without meaning to, the first real smile she had allowed herself since the wedding. Over the following 2 weeks, their meetings in the garden became something Alina did not plan but did not avoid either. Nathaniel was easy to talk to in a way no one else in her new life was. He did not perform politeness the way the household staff did, careful and distant. He did not measure her worth the way Vivian did, searching for weaknesses to exploit. He simply spoke to her as though she were a person whose thoughts mattered, and after weeks of being treated like an arrangement, that alone felt like water after a long drought. He noticed things. He noticed when she stopped eating breakfast because Vivian's comments had grown too sharp to sit through. He noticed when her hands trembled slightly after a phone call with her father, still struggling under the weight of debts that never seemed to shrink. He noticed the exhaustion behind her polite smiles at public events, the ones Julian required her to attend but never prepared her for. One evening, a formal dinner had been arranged with several of Julian's business partners, the kind of event where Alina was expected to stand beside her husband and say nothing of substance, while men in expensive suits discussed numbers that would decide the fate of her father's company. She had not eaten all day, too nervous to keep food down, and by the time she arrived at the estate's private dining hall, her vision had begun to swim at the edges. Nathaniel, there to present final drawings for the foundation project before the meal began, was the first to notice her sway slightly near the doorway. Without drawing attention, he stepped beside her and in a voice low enough that only she could hear said, "There is a chair just behind you. Sit before anyone notices." She sat. He brought her a glass of water without being asked, setting it down as though it were the most natural gesture in the world, and then he returned to his own place across the room, never once claiming credit for the kindness, never once making her feel as though she owed him anything for it. Julian, seated at the head of the table, did not notice any of it. He was deep in conversation about supply contracts, his attention entirely elsewhere, and Alina understood in that moment the difference between a man who owned her presence and a man who simply saw her. The dinner passed in its usual haze of polite nothing, but for the first time, Alina did not feel entirely alone inside it. She caught Nathaniel's eye once across the table, and he gave the smallest nod, the kind that said only, "I am here if you need steadiness," nothing more, nothing that could be mistaken for anything improper. It was enough. Afterward, walking back toward the east wing alone, while Julian remained behind to finish business discussions, Alina found herself replaying the small moment of kindness over and over, turning it in her mind like a stone she did not want to put down. She told herself it meant nothing. He was simply a decent man, doing what any decent man would do. But decency had become rare enough in her life that even small measures of it now felt significant. Vivian, of course, noticed. Vivian noticed everything that could later be used as a weapon. "You looked quite comfortable with the architect tonight," she said the next morning, stirring sugar into her coffee with deliberate slowness. "Careful, Alina. My brother may not want you, but he certainly will not share you, not publicly. Appearances matter to this family, even when nothing else does." "Nothing happened," Alina said, keeping her voice steady despite the heat rising in her chest. "Of course not," Vivian said, smiling in a way that suggested she believed the opposite and intended to remember it. "Not yet." Elena said nothing further, but the comment lodged itself under her skin, a warning she could not entirely dismiss. She was careful after that, more careful in the garden, more careful at events, aware that every small kindness she allowed herself to receive was being catalogued somewhere by eyes that wished her harm. But carefulness did not stop her heart from noticing what her mind tried to ignore. Over the following weeks, small things continued to accumulate between her and Nathaniel, none of them improper, all of them quietly meaningful. He remembered that she took her tea without sugar. He noticed when new bruises of exhaustion darkened beneath her eyes, and without commentary, arranged for his sight meetings to run later in the day, so she would have someone to talk to in the evenings when the house grew too quiet to bear. He never asked about her marriage directly, never pushed for details she was not ready to share, and that restraint made her trust him more than any direct question could have. Julian, meanwhile, remained locked behind the same wall he had built the night he warned her never to enter his heart. He was not unkind exactly, not the way Vivian was, but he was absent in every way that mattered, a husband in title only. His mind, occupied by grief Elena, did not yet understand and business matters that consumed every waking hour. She began to notice the shape of his sadness, even without knowing its cause, the way his eyes sometimes lingered too long on a framed photograph in his study, a woman she did not recognize, before he caught himself and looked away. She did not ask him about it. She had learned already that questions in this house were rarely welcomed, and some doors, she suspected, were locked for reasons deeper than simple coldness. But the mystery of that photograph, and the grief behind Julian's guarded eyes, settled into the back of her mind, waiting for the moment it would finally demand to be understood. For now, Elena's world had quietly split into two halves. One half was cold marble hallways, a husband who barely looked at her, and a sister-in-law who watched her like prey. The other half was a wild garden behind a stone wall, a quiet man with kind eyes, and small moments of decency that were slowly, without either of them fully admitting it, becoming something neither of them was prepared to name. She did not yet know how far that quiet growing warmth would carry her, or how much it would cost the fragile peace she had built for herself inside a house that had never once felt like home. The black car arrived without warning on a gray Tuesday morning, its tires crunching over the gravel drive with a sound that made every member of the household staff move faster, straighten their uniforms, and disappear into corners as though bracing for a storm. Elena watched from an upstairs window as a tall woman stepped out, silver hair pinned with precision, her coat cut in a style that belonged to another decade but somehow still commanded the entire property with a single glance upward. Constance Cross had returned, and the house seemed to hold its breath around her. Elena had heard the name only in passing, always spoken carefully, always followed by silence. Julian's mother had not visited the estate in over 2 years, and no one in the household seemed willing to explain why. By the time Elena reached the main hall, Constance was already inside, removing her gloves finger by finger, her sharp eyes sweeping the space until they landed directly on Elena. "So you are the girl," Constance said, echoing Vivian's earlier words but without any of her daughter's cruelty. There was something else in her tone instead, something closer to curiosity or perhaps concern. "Come, walk with me." It was not a request Elena felt she could refuse. She followed Constance through the halls, past portraits of stern ancestors, until they reached a small sitting room Elena had never entered before, tucked away behind a set of doors she had assumed were simply storage. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old books and something floral, long faded. "My son warned you, didn't he?" Constance said, settling into a chair by the window without waiting for an answer. "Never enter my heart. He said something like that, I imagine. He said the same thing to himself over and over for the past 3 years. Elena's breath caught slightly. "I don't understand." Constance studied her for a long moment before continuing, her voice quieter now, carrying the weight of something rarely spoken aloud. "There was a woman before you, Sophia. Julian loved her the way young men love only once in their lives, completely, without caution. They were to be married before you ever entered this family's plans. What happened to her? Elena asked, though part of her already sensed the answer would not be simple. She disappeared, Constance said. Not died, disappeared, though for a long time we all believed the worst. One day she was here planning a future with my son, and the next she was gone, no note, no warning, nothing but silence where a life used to be. Julian searched for months. He nearly ruined himself searching. And when he finally stopped, he built a wall instead, brick by brick, until nothing could reach him anymore. Elena sat very still, the pieces of Julian's coldness rearranging themselves into a shape she had not expected. It was not indifference she had been living with. It was grief that had never been allowed to heal, grief so deep it had calcified into the very warning he had given her on their wedding night. "Why are you telling me this?" Elena asked finally. "Because someone should," Constance said simply. "And because I do not believe Sophia simply vanished on her own. I believe something happened to her, something this family has never properly investigated, and I believe the truth is still buried somewhere close to home. I have my suspicions, but suspicion is not proof, and proof has been difficult to find." The conversation left Elena unsettled for days afterward, her understanding of Julian shifting beneath her like ground during an earthquake. She began to notice details she had previously dismissed as simple coldness. The way his eyes lingered on the framed photograph in his study before he caught himself. The way certain dates on the calendar made his jaw tighten without explanation. The way he sometimes stood at the window of his office long after the sun had set, staring at nothing, lost somewhere she could not follow. She did not tell him what his mother had shared. Some instinct told her the knowledge was not yet hers to reveal. That trust between them would need to be built before truths that fragile could be spoken aloud without breaking something further. Instead, she carried the knowledge quietly, and it changed the way she watched him, softened her frustration into something closer to understanding, even as the distance between them remained as wide as ever. Vivian's behavior, meanwhile, grew stranger during Constance's visit, sharper in some moments and unusually careful in others, as though she were watching her mother's presence in the house the way a person watches a fire that might spread in an unpredictable direction. Elena noticed the tension between mother and daughter, the careful way Constance's eyes followed Vivian across a room, and she began to wonder, though she could not yet say why, whether Vivian's cruelty toward her was covering something larger than simple resentment. One evening, walking past Julian's study on her way to bed, Elena overheard raised voices behind the door, Constance's sharp and accusing, Vivian's defensive and clipped. She could not make out full sentences, only fragments, something about old contracts, something about a name Elena did not recognize, spoken with unusual weight, something about Sophia, mentioned once, quickly silenced. She did not stay to listen further. Some part of her understood that whatever was unfolding behind that door was larger and older than anything she yet understood, a tangle of family history and hidden betrayal that predated her arrival by years. But she also understood with growing certainty that it would not remain hidden much longer, and that when it finally surfaced, it would change everything, for Julian, for the family, and quite possibly for her. The next morning at breakfast, Constance announced she would be extending her stay indefinitely, her tone leaving no room for argument. Julian said nothing in protest, though something in his posture suggested he understood, better than Elena did, exactly what his mother's continued presence meant. Vivian excused herself early, her plate barely touched, her composure noticeably thinner than usual. Elena, watching the three of them navigate a silence thick with unspoken history, found herself, for the first time since her wedding, genuinely curious rather than simply frightened about what this family was hiding, and increasingly certain that whatever truth waited beneath the surface would eventually pull her into its center whether she was prepared for it or not. Later that day, needing air and space to think, she found her way to the garden and found Nathaniel there as well, sketching the old stone wall with quiet concentration. He looked up when she approached, immediately noticing something different in her expression. "You look like someone carrying a heavy thought," he said. "I am," she admitted, sitting on the low stone bench near where he worked. "I found out something about this family, something about Julian. I don't know what to do with it." Nathaniel did not press her for details, and she did not offer them, but simply sitting near him in the quiet garden, the weight in her chest eased slightly, as though sharing the burden's existence without sharing its specifics was enough to make it bearable. He continued sketching, unhurried, occasionally asking small, undemanding questions about her day. And by the time she returned inside, the tightness in her shoulders had loosened for the first time since Constance's car had rolled up the gravel drive that morning. She did not yet know that the truth waiting beneath her new family's careful silence was closer, and more dangerous, than she could have imagined, or that the very person who had shown her the most kindness since her wedding day would soon become tangled in its unraveling as well. The ballroom of the Whitmore Hotel glittered with the kind of wealth that made ordinary conversation feel like performance. Chandeliers throwing gold light across marble floors, string music weaving through 100 quiet conversations about mergers and inheritances. Alina stood near the edge of the gathering in a pale blue gown chosen for her rather than by her, smiling the practiced smile she had perfected over months of similar evenings, when Vivian approached with 2 glasses of champagne and a smile sharp enough to cut glass. "You must be so proud," Vivian said loudly enough for the small cluster of guests nearby to hear, handing Alina a glass she had not asked for. "Married into one of the wealthiest families in the city, and all it cost was your father's dignity and a signature on a contract. Tell me, Alina, does it feel like love, or does it simply feel like a very expensive job?" The nearby conversations quieted. Alina felt heat rush to her face, her carefully constructed composure threatening to crack in front of dozens of watching eyes. She searched instinctively for Julian, hoping for even a small gesture of defense, a look, a word, anything. He stood only a few feet away, deep in conversation with a business associate, and though he must have heard every word Vivian had spoken, he said nothing. He did not even turn his head. The silence stretched, and in that silence, Alina understood something with painful clarity. Whatever protection she had imagined existing between them, whatever quiet loyalty a marriage was supposed to guarantee, did not exist here. She was alone in this glittering room full of people, and her husband, standing close enough to touch, had chosen not to close the distance. She set the untouched champagne glass on a passing tray and walked away before her composure could shatter completely, moving quickly through the crowd toward the hotel's terrace doors, needing air, needing space, needing anywhere that was not this room full of watching eyes and empty gold light. Behind her, she heard Vivian's laughter carry across the ballroom, light and cruel, and no one, not one person, moved to defend her. Outside, the night air was cold against her heated skin, the city stretching below the terrace in a wash of distant lights. She gripped the stone railing and let the tears finally come, quiet and furious, months of accumulated humiliation finally breaking free in the privacy of the dark. She did not hear him approach until his voice came softly from a few steps away. "Alina." She turned, startled, quickly wiping her face, embarrassed to be found this way. Nathaniel stood near the terrace doors, having clearly followed her out, his expression carrying none of the ballroom's judgment, only quiet concern. "You don't have to explain anything," he said, closing the distance slowly, giving her every opportunity to ask him to stop. "I just didn't want you standing out here alone." "He didn't say anything," Alina said, her voice breaking despite her effort to keep it steady. "His own sister humiliated me in front of everyone, and he didn't say a single word." "I know," Nathaniel said simply. "I saw." "Why does everyone in that room think I deserve this?" she asked, the question tearing loose from somewhere deep and unguarded. "You don't," he said, no hesitation in his voice at all. "You have done nothing wrong, Alina. You married into a family that has never learned how to be kind to the people inside it. That is not a reflection of you. It never was." She looked at him then, really looked, taking in the steadiness of his presence, the way he had followed her not to comfort himself but simply to make sure she was not alone in her pain. Something in her chest, tight and guarded for months, loosened just slightly. He did not say anything more. He simply reached out slowly, giving her every chance to step back, and took her hand in his. It was not a grand gesture. It was quiet, careful, a simple offering of steadiness rather than a claim on anything more. But standing there on that cold terrace, her hand resting in his, Alina felt something she had not felt since walking through the iron gates of the Cross estate months earlier. She felt chosen, not for her usefulness, not for the debts her marriage had erased, but simply for herself. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The city lights blurred slightly through the last of her tears, and the noise of the ballroom behind them faded into something distant and unimportant. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, steadier. "Thank you for following me." "I would follow you every time," he said, and though the words were simple, they carried a weight that neither of them was ready to fully name. They returned inside separately several minutes later, careful not to draw attention, but something between them had shifted permanently on that terrace, quiet and undeniable. Alina rejoined the party with her composure restored, but her heart no longer felt entirely her own to guard, and for the rest of the evening she found herself searching the room not for Julian's approval, but for the quiet reassurance of Nathaniel's presence somewhere nearby. Julian, unaware of what had unfolded on the terrace, noticed only that his wife's demeanor had changed by the time they left the ballroom together, something steadier in the set of her shoulders that had not been there when they arrived. He did not ask why. He rarely asked why about anything concerning her, and that evening, riding home in careful silence beside a woman who had just discovered what it felt like to be chosen by someone else, his continued distance cost him more than he yet understood. Word travels quickly inside a house full of servants who see everything and say nothing until it becomes useful. It was Vivian who first planted the idea in Julian's mind, dropping it carefully over dinner one evening like a coin into still water, watching for the ripples. "I saw your wife on the terrace at the Whitmore Gala," she said, cutting into her food without looking up. "With the architect, they seemed quite close." Julian said nothing at first, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth before continuing as though the comment meant nothing. But that night, alone in his study, staring at the same framed photograph he had avoided for years, he found himself unable to concentrate on the documents in front of him, his mind circling back again and again to the image of Alina standing close to another man, a man who had apparently offered her something Julian had refused to give. He told himself the feeling twisting in his chest was concern for appearances, nothing more. A scandal would damage the family name, complicate business relationships, invite gossip he had spent years avoiding. But lying awake that night, staring at the ceiling of a bedroom he had chosen to keep separate from his wife's, he was forced to admit, quietly and reluctantly, that the feeling was not concern for reputation at all. It was something closer to jealousy, sharp and unfamiliar, an emotion he had not allowed himself to feel toward anyone since Sophia disappeared. The realization unsettled him more than the jealousy itself. He had built his entire life around the belief that he was incapable of feeling that way again, that the wall he had constructed after Sophia's disappearance was permanent, impenetrable, safe. The fact that Alina, a woman he had warned away from his heart on their very first night together, had somehow found a crack in that wall without his permission, left him feeling exposed in a way he did not know how to manage. Rather than confront the feeling directly, Julian did what he always did when emotions became too complicated to face. He buried himself in work, specifically in a task he had avoided for years, reopening the investigation into Sophia's disappearance. If he could not understand what he felt for Alina, perhaps he could at least finally understand what had happened to the woman whose loss had shaped every decision he had made since. He began quietly, pulling old files from storage, revisiting contacts he had not spoken to in years, following threads he had once been too devastated to pursue fully. What he found troubled him more than he expected. Sophia's disappearance had coincided almost exactly with a hostile business maneuver against the Cross family trust, one that had ultimately failed, but not before several key documents related to foundation funding had gone missing under circumstances no one had ever fully explained. The name that kept surfacing, buried in old correspondence and financial records, belonged to a man named Edmund Cole, a rival executive who had once sought a position within the Cross Corporation and had been quietly, firmly rejected by Julian's father years earlier. Cole had disappeared from the business world shortly after Sophia vanished, resurfacing years later under a different company name, his connections to the Cross family carefully hidden behind layers of legal separation. More troubling still, as Julian dug deeper into old records, he found evidence of continued financial contact between Cole's new company and someone still inside the Cross household, transactions disguised as consulting fees, communications routed through channels designed to avoid easy tracing. He did not yet know who inside his own family might be involved, but the possibility settled over him like a shadow he could not shake. He said nothing to Alina about any of it, not yet trusting himself to explain feelings he barely understood, let alone suspicions he could not yet prove. But something in him had shifted since the night Vivian mentioned the terrace, a restlessness that would not settle, a growing awareness that the wall he had built around his heart was not protecting him anymore. It was simply keeping him isolated inside a house full of people who were quietly reshaping his life without his permission, some with kindness, some with hidden agendas he was only beginning to uncover. Meanwhile, Alina noticed the change in Julian without understanding its cause. He began appearing at breakfast more consistently, asking small questions about her day that he had never bothered to ask before, questions that felt awkward and unpracticed, as though he were relearning a language he had once known fluently and then deliberately forgotten. She answered carefully, unsure what had prompted the shift, cautious not to hope for too much from a man who had warned her so clearly against expecting anything at all. One evening, passing his study on her way to bed, she noticed the door slightly open, and through the gap she saw him standing at his desk, surrounded by old files and photographs, his expression heavier than she had ever seen it. She hesitated at the doorway, uncertain whether to intrude, when he looked up and saw her there. "I am sorry," she said quickly, stepping back. "I didn't mean to interrupt." "Wait," he said, and something in his voice, rough and unfamiliar, made her pause. "Alina, can I ask you something?" She stepped into the doorway, cautious. "Of course." He hesitated, his eyes moving briefly to the framed photograph on his desk before returning to her. "Do you regret marrying me?" The question hung in the air between them, heavier than anything he had said to her since the night he warned her never to enter his heart. She considered it carefully before answering, unwilling to offer him a comfortable lie. "I regret how it began," she said honestly. "I regret that neither of us had a real choice. But I don't regret who I have become since arriving in this house, and I don't think that is entirely because of you." Something flickered across his face at that, something that might have been hurt or might have been understanding. She could not tell which. He nodded slowly, accepting her honesty without argument, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them different now, less cold, more uncertain, as though both of them were standing at the edge of something neither fully understood yet. "Good night, Julian," she said finally, and left him alone with his files, his photographs, and the growing weight of feelings he was only beginning to admit he still carried. The message arrived on Alina's phone late on a Thursday night, an unknown number, a single line of text that made her blood turn cold. "Stop meeting the architect, or your father's company will discover exactly how unstable its new investors truly are." She read it 3 times, her hands trembling, before understanding settled over her like ice water. Someone was watching her. Someone knew about the garden, about the terrace, about every quiet moment she had believed belonged only to her and Nathaniel. She did not sleep that night. By morning, dark circles shadowed her eyes, and when Julian noticed at breakfast, his concern, still new and unpracticed, pushed him to ask directly what was wrong. She hesitated, then, deciding secrecy had already cost her enough, showed him the message. Julian's expression hardened as he read it, his jaw tightening in a way Alina had not seen since the night of their wedding. "This is connected," he said quietly, almost to himself. "This has to be connected to Cole." He explained quickly, urgently, everything he had uncovered over the past weeks. The old business betrayal, the missing foundation funds, the resurfaced rival executive whose name kept appearing in disguised transactions, and the unsettling suspicion that someone still inside the household was helping Cole maintain his hidden reach into the family's affairs. Alina listened, piecing together fragments she had gathered from Constance's earlier warning, from overheard arguments behind closed doors, from Vivian's strange tension during her mother's extended visit. "It's Vivian," Alina said slowly, the realization solidifying as she spoke it aloud. "It has to be." They confronted her together that afternoon, in the same sitting room where Constance had first revealed the truth about Sophia. Vivian's composure cracked the moment Julian placed a folder of financial records on the table between them, transactions tracing directly back to accounts connected to Edmund Cole, dates that aligned precisely with moments of tension inside the family, including, damningly, the week of Sophia's disappearance years earlier. "You were helping him," Julian said, his voice dangerously quiet, "this entire time." Vivian's mask finally slipped, years of careful cruelty giving way to something rawer, more desperate. "He promised me control of the foundation division if I helped him weaken Father's hold on the trust. I didn't know what he would do to Sophia. I swear I didn't know he would go that far. By the time I understood, it was already too late to undo it, and he made it clear what would happen to me if I ever spoke." The full truth spilled out slowly, painfully. Cole had discovered Sophia's growing suspicion about irregular foundation transactions years earlier and had orchestrated her sudden disappearance, threatening her safety and her family's well-being if she did not leave quietly and never return, exploiting Vivian's ambition to maintain his hidden access to the family's affairs from within. Sophia had not died. She had been forced into hiding, terrified and alone, believing she had no other way to protect the people she loved. Julian sat in stunned silence as the pieces of 3 years of unexplained grief rearranged themselves into a shape far more painful and far more solvable than he had ever allowed himself to hope. Sophia was alive, and the man responsible for years of suffering, his own family's suffering and hers, had now turned his threats toward Alina, determined to protect a secret that was rapidly unraveling. That evening, urgency replaced grief as the family's priority. Julian contacted private investigators he trusted completely, providing them with everything he had uncovered, while simultaneously arranging additional security around the estate, aware that Cole, cornered and desperate, might escalate his threats further now that his hidden operation was collapsing. Nathaniel, informed of the danger by Alina herself, insisted on staying close during the tense days that followed, not out of any claim on her, but out of simple, steady concern for her safety. His presence, calm and unwavering, became an anchor for Alina amid the chaos unfolding around her, even as she understood the complicated position it placed her in, caught between a husband, finally opening his guarded heart, and a man who had shown her unwavering kindness long before Julian ever tried. 2 nights later, the investigators located Cole at a private property outside the city, his operation collapsing around him as financial regulators, alerted by Julian's evidence, began freezing accounts connected to his shell companies. Cole did not go quietly. When authorities arrived, he attempted to flee through a service exit, only to be intercepted, his years of hidden manipulation finally brought into the light. Sophia was found within days, living quietly under a different name in a small coastal town, having spent 3 years in careful hiding, terrified of a threat she had believed impossible to escape. When Julian finally spoke with her by phone, his voice breaking with relief and years of unresolved grief, she confirmed everything Vivian had revealed, filling in the final painful details of a betrayal that had shaped so much of the family's recent history. Vivian, facing the full consequences of her involvement, was removed from any position of authority within the family trust, her future now tangled in legal proceedings she could not escape through charm or manipulation. Constance, though devastated by her daughter's choices, stood firmly beside Julian throughout the unraveling, finally able to grieve Sophia's loss properly now that the mystery surrounding it had been solved. Alina, watching the family she had married into fracture and begin its slow process of healing, found herself standing at the center of something she had never anticipated when she walked through those iron gates months earlier. The threat against her had passed. The truth about Sophia had finally surfaced. And Julian, freed from years of unresolved grief and guilt, was beginning, for the first time, to truly see her, not as an arrangement, not as an obligation, but as someone he had genuinely come to care for during the very weeks he had tried hardest to keep her at a distance. But freedom from old grief did not erase the quiet bond that had grown between Alina and Nathaniel. During the months, Julian remained locked behind his wall. As the danger passed and the household began to settle into a strange, uncertain calm, Alina understood that the hardest part of her story was not the conspiracy that had just been resolved. It was the choice still waiting quietly ahead of her, between the husband finally opening his heart and the gentle man who had never once asked her to change hers. The house grew quieter in the days following Cole's arrest, a strange, careful quiet, the kind that settles after a storm has passed, but before anyone is certain it will not return. Vivian's absence left empty spaces at the breakfast table that no one quite knew how to fill, and Constance moved through the halls with the weary relief of a woman who had finally been allowed to grieve properly after years of unanswered questions. Julian sought Alina out on a cool evening nearly a week after the truth had fully surfaced, finding her in the garden behind the east wing, the place that had become, without either of them planning it, the quiet center of everything that mattered most in her new life. He stood at the edge of the stone path for a long moment before speaking, as though gathering courage for something far more difficult than confronting Cole's conspiracy had been. "I owe you an apology," he said finally, his voice lacking its usual careful control. "Not just for the night at the Whitmore Gala, though I owe you one for that too. I owe you an apology for every day since our wedding that I treated you like an obligation, instead of a person." Alina turned to face him, saying nothing yet, waiting to see whether this was another guarded gesture or something genuinely different. "I built a wall after Sophia disappeared," he continued, "because I believed feeling anything again would be a betrayal of what I lost. I told myself protecting that wall was strength. I understand now it was simply fear, dressed up as control, and I let that fear cost you months of loneliness in a house that should have welcomed you." "Why are you telling me this now?" Alina asked quietly. "Because Sophia is alive," he said, "and finding that out did not heal the wall around my heart the way I expected it to. Something else did that. Watching you survive this family with more grace than any of us deserved. Watching you find kindness in this house despite every reason not to. I did not build that wall to protect myself from losing Sophia again. I built it to avoid ever caring about anyone the way I cared about her. And somewhere in the last few months, without my permission, I started caring about you anyway." The confession hung in the evening air between them, honest in a way Julian had never allowed himself to be with her before. Alina felt the weight of it settle into her chest, complicated and heavy, because she knew, standing in the very garden where her friendship with Nathaniel had first taken root, that Julian's words came too late to erase everything that had grown quietly in the space his absence had left behind. "I don't know what to do with what you're telling me," she admitted honestly. "You warned me never to enter your heart, and I built my own protections because of that warning. I found kindness elsewhere, Julian, because you made it clear I would not find it with you. I can't simply set that aside because circumstances have changed." Julian nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of her honesty without argument or anger, understanding, perhaps for the first time, that his own choices had shaped the very distance he now regretted. "I am not asking you to set anything aside," he said. "I am only asking you to know that the wall is gone now, and whatever you choose to do with that truth is entirely yours to decide." He left her alone in the garden after that, giving her the space he had never thought to offer before, and Alina sat for a long time beneath the old tree, turning his words over in her mind, aware that the simple, uncomplicated survival she had been managing for months had suddenly become something far more difficult to navigate. She found Nathaniel 2 days later, working late on the final drawings for the foundation building, the project nearing its completion after months of steady work. He looked up when she entered, immediately noticing the uncertainty in her expression. "Julian apologized," she said simply, sitting across from him at the drafting table. "He told me the wall is gone. He told me he cares about me." Nathaniel set down his pencil carefully, giving her his full attention. "And how does that make you feel?" "Confused," she admitted. "Grateful in a strange way that he finally sees me. But also aware that his seeing me now doesn't erase the months when he didn't, and doesn't erase what grew between us during those months either." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, choosing his words with the same careful attention he gave everything. "I have never asked you for anything, Alina, and I am not going to start now. Whatever you decide about your marriage, about your future, I want you to decide it because it is genuinely what you want, not because you feel loyalty to either of us. You deserve a choice that belongs entirely to you." His restraint, even now, even with everything unspoken between them finally hanging in the open air, was exactly why she had come to trust him so deeply in the first place. He had never once tried to claim her. He had simply, quietly shown her what it felt like to be valued without condition. And that gift, freely given, could not be undone by Julian's late apology, no matter how sincere it was. "I need time," she said finally. "Not to punish either of you, just to understand what I actually want, separate from what either of you is offering me." "Take all the time you need," Nathaniel said, and meant it completely. She left him there among his drawings, walking slowly back through the quieting halls of the Cross estate, aware that the choice ahead of her would not be easy, and aware, too, for the first time since walking through those iron gates months earlier, that it was entirely, genuinely hers to make. 3 weeks passed before Alina found her answer, 3 weeks during which the household finally settled into something resembling peace. Sophia returned briefly to the city, not to reclaim any part of Julian's life, but to formally close the chapter that Cole's conspiracy had forced open years earlier, and to help finalize the legal proceedings against both Cole and Vivian. Her meeting with Julian was brief, quiet, and free of old expectations, two people acknowledging a shared history without any desire to relive it. She left the city again within days, choosing to build her future somewhere far from the family whose hidden fractures had cost her 3 lost years. Constance, meanwhile, threw herself into repairing what remained of the family's public reputation, working closely with Julian to restructure the foundation's leadership, ensuring the kind of transparency that might prevent another Cole from ever finding a foothold inside their affairs again. She and Alina grew closer during those weeks as well, an unexpected friendship forming between the older woman and the daughter-in-law she had once approached with cautious curiosity, now approached with genuine warmth. Alina spent much of that time exactly as she had spent her earliest days in the mansion, in the garden behind the east wing, though now the space felt different, no longer merely an escape from a cold house, but a place where she had slowly, deliberately, learned who she wanted to become. She thought carefully about Julian's late honesty, about the vulnerability it had cost him to finally tear down a wall he had spent 3 years building. She thought, too, about Nathaniel's quiet steadiness, the months of unclaimed kindness that had never once asked anything of her in return. She realized, sitting beneath the old tree on a clear autumn afternoon, that the question was not truly about choosing between two men. It was about choosing what kind of life she wanted to build, and what kind of love she believed she deserved, freely given rather than slowly earned through crisis and apology. She sought out Julian first, finding him in his study, the same room where he had first confessed the weight of the wall he had built. He looked up when she entered, something hopeful and uncertain crossing his features. "I have thought about everything you said," she began, "and I believe you meant every word of your apology. I believe the wall really is gone. But Julian, I cannot build a marriage on the relief of a wall finally coming down. I need to know that what grows between two people is chosen freely, every day, not simply unlocked after grief finally loosens its grip." Julian absorbed her words slowly, and though disappointment flickered across his face, it was followed quickly by something steadier, something that looked unexpectedly like respect. "What are you asking for?" "Time," she said. "Not separation, not immediately, but time to rebuild this marriage as two people who actually choose each other, rather than two people bound together by contracts and inherited grief. If we can build something real, slowly, honestly, then I am willing to try. But I will not pretend the last few months did not happen, and I will not pretend my heart has not grown to care for someone who showed me kindness when you could not." Julian nodded slowly, understanding settling into his expression, quiet and genuine. "Then we will try it your way," he said. "Slowly, honestly, without warnings this time." It was not the sweeping declaration a lesser story might have offered, no grand promise of instant transformation, but it was real. And Alina found, walking out of his study that afternoon, that real was worth infinitely more than the performance of love she had feared for so long inside this house. She found Nathaniel later that same evening, standing near the completed foundation building, its glass and stone finally finished after months of careful work. He turned when he heard her approach, reading the outcome in her expression before she spoke a single word. "You're going to try with him," he said, no bitterness in his voice, only quiet understanding. "I am," she confirmed. "Slowly, honestly. I don't know where it will lead, but Nathaniel, I need you to know that what grew between us these past months was real too. It was the first time in this entire ordeal that I felt genuinely seen, and I will never regret a single moment of it." "I don't regret it either," he said. "I told you once I would follow you every time, and I meant it. That doesn't have to mean walking beside you forever. Sometimes it simply means making sure you found your way to where you were meant to be." There was sadness in his voice, honest and unhidden, but no resentment, no attempt to change her mind. He had shown her, from the very first quiet nod across a crowded ballroom, what it meant to care for someone without demanding anything in return. And even now, watching her choose a different path, he remained exactly that same steady, generous presence. They said their goodbyes quietly that evening, not as strangers, but as two people who had genuinely mattered to each other during a season that both of them would carry forward, changed by the experience in ways neither fully expected. Nathaniel completed his work on the foundation building within the month and accepted a new project in another city, choosing distance not out of anger, but out of respect for the boundary Alina needed to rebuild her marriage honestly. Months later, the Cross estate looked much the same from the outside, iron gates and cold marble halls, but inside something fundamental had shifted. Julian and Alina built their marriage slowly, deliberately, choosing honesty over performance, presence over obligation. He learned to ask about her day and truly listen to the answer. She learned to trust that his care was genuine, tested now by time rather than promised through empty warnings. It was not a fairy tale transformation, but something steadier and more durable, a love built brick by brick in the very space where a wall had once stood. Alina often returned to the garden behind the east wing, the place where everything had first begun to change, and sometimes, standing beneath the old tree, she thought of Nathaniel, grateful for the quiet kindness that had taught her what it felt like to be valued without condition, a lesson that had ultimately shaped the very marriage she chose to build. The heart, she had come to understand, does not enter on command, and it does not stay locked out by warning alone. It enters freely in its own time through the smallest, quietest acts of genuine care, and it is choice, not command, that decides where it finally chooses to stay. A year passed, and the Cross estate welcomed spring with gardens that Alina had slowly reshaped into something warmer than the cold formality that once defined the property. She had kept the wild corner behind the east wing exactly as it was, refusing to let anyone tame it, and had gradually extended its spirit outward, softening the manicured perfection of the rest of the grounds with color and life that reflected who she had become rather than who the house once demanded she pretend to be. Julian had changed as well, in ways that surprised even those who had known him longest. He arrived home earlier most evenings now, choosing dinner conversations over solitary work in his study, asking Alina about her days with genuine curiosity rather than obligatory politeness. Their marriage had not become effortless, and both of them understood it likely never would be entirely effortless, built as it was on the foundation of a difficult beginning. But it had become honest, and honesty, they had both learned, mattered far more than the illusion of ease. Constance remained close, her relationship with Alina deepening into something like the mother-daughter bond neither had expected when Constance first arrived through those iron gates demanding answers about a marriage gone cold. She often joined Alina in the garden on quiet afternoons, the two of them speaking freely about the family's difficult history, about Sophia's ongoing new life far from the city, about Vivian's slow, uncertain path through legal consequences, and the difficult work of rebuilding a life from the wreckage of poor choices made in pursuit of power she was never meant to hold. Sophia wrote occasionally, brief letters describing a quiet life she had built for herself near the coast, free now of the fear that had shaped her disappearance. She and Julian had made peace with their shared past, neither reaching for what once existed between them, both grateful instead for the strange, painful path that had ultimately led each of them toward lives they were finally free to build honestly. Nathaniel's foundation building stood finished and celebrated, a striking piece of architecture that had become one of the city's most admired public spaces. And though Alina visited it occasionally, admiring the clean lines and thoughtful design that reflected the quiet, careful man who created it, she and Nathaniel exchanged only occasional messages, warm but appropriately distant, two people who had once mattered deeply to each other during a difficult season, now living separate lives shaped in part by what they had once shared. He had built a growing reputation in his new city, his talent finally receiving the recognition it deserved, and Alina was genuinely glad, without complication, to see him thriving. On quiet evenings, sitting with Julian in the garden that had become the true heart of their home, Alina sometimes thought back to the rain-soaked night she first arrived through those iron gates, a stranger warned away from her husband's heart before she had even stepped inside his home. She thought about how far both of them had traveled since that cold warning, how much had needed to break apart before something honest could finally be built in its place. She had learned, through every difficult month of that first uncertain year, that love could not be commanded into existence through contracts or warned away through fear. It arrived quietly, through small acts of genuine care, through patience, through the slow, deliberate choice to see another person clearly and choose them anyway, again and again, long after the initial spark of circumstance had faded. It was not the love she had expected walking through those gates as a frightened, obligated bride. It was something steadier, something chosen freely by two people who had finally learned what it meant to let someone truly enter their hearts. And in the garden where everything had first begun to change, beneath the old tree that had witnessed every quiet turning point of her transformation, Alina finally understood that the heart, once genuinely opened, does not close again easily. It simply learns, through time and honesty and the courage to choose vulnerability over protection, exactly where it was always meant to belong.